So welcome. My name is Libby Bischoff, and I'm the Executive Director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education here at the University of Southern Maine. We are delighted to virtually have you here with us this morning. I am in Portland, in Machigan, on the unceded homelands of the Wabanaki. It's really nice to welcome everyone here. We have a great variety of people from all over here with us today in this virtual space. So if you're so inclined to want to pop in the chat and say hello and where you're checking in from today, that would be great. It would be wonderful to know who we have with us. This is definitely a Zoom format, as you well know, and I know people are very familiar with Zoom, but once Jessica starts presenting, clicking on the speaker view will probably be best, so you can see her slides and then what she is presenting about. We will move into Dr. Parr's presentation shortly. They'll present for about 35-40 minutes, and then we will open it up into a robust Q&A. So we'll have questions for the end. At the end, you'll be more than welcome to type your question in the chat, or if you want to use that reaction button at the end and raise your hand, more than happy to call on you to unmute and ask your question. Monday Map Lunch is a series we started a couple of years ago that invites scholars and practitioners from near and far to present on their current endeavors in a kind of informal environment, followed by a robust Q&A session. So we have a wonderful lineup of Monday Map Lunch presenters this semester, and we can also drop that in the chat for folks. So welcome. I am going to introduce our speaker and then turn it over to her. So Dr. Jessica Parr is a historian of the early modern Atlantic world. They specialize in race and memory in the long 18th century, as well as in digital humanities and archival studies. Dr. Parr is a professor of practice in digital humanities at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. And they're the author of Inventing George Whitefield, Race, Revivalism, and the Making of a Religious Icon from the University of Mississippi Press. And this is sort of leading into Dr. Parr's contemporary work as well. So the current manuscript project, which is also the subject of this talk, explores the way in which African-American anti-slavery activists navigated the political structures and social structures that both codified and perpetuated slavery between 1760 and 1860. And in this manuscript, Dr. Parr employs critical race theory, digital humanities methodologists to argue that these activists created geographies of resistance that were shaped around the structures of slavery and white supremacy. And it's really that notion of the geographies of resistance, geographies of emancipation, and the use of geospatial technology in this project that made us want to invite Dr. Parr to share the work on Monday Map Lunch. So Jessica, thank you so much for being with us. So delighted to have you. Thanks everyone for tuning in. And I am going to mute and turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you, Libby. I'm going to unmute. My office is about a 5-minute walk from the Ruggles T station, and the lunchtime commuter rail trains just came through. So I want to be on quiet while the ruckus was going on. I am going to share my screen. The work that I'm presenting today is a methodology piece that is based on, it's going to appear in a volume called The Age of Revolutions in a Digital Age that is coming out with Cornell University Press in this coming August, but also forms some of the foundational methodologies of my work for a longer monograph project that is under contract with UNC Press, and I am supposed to be delivering also in August. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the methodology today, and I'm happy to answer questions about the broader book project, etc., further along. So, in his preface to the 1818 translation of the Haitian Papers, the Black attorney and abolitionist Prince Saunders sought to set before the British more correct information with respect to the enlightened policy systems of policy, the pacific spirits, and the altogether domestic views and the liberal principles of government of the young Black Republic. So, this is an American attorney writing about post-emancipation Haiti, just as discussions about abolitionism are heating up. Saunders, a formerly enslaved and Dartmouth-educated man, sought to reframe how white observers conceived of a Black governed political space, which Saunders, a formerly enslaved um, oops, which Saunders called a quote, new and truly interesting empire. His writing really exemplifies one of the ways that Black abolitionists seek to sort of center Black liberation on Black political spaces. So reimagining maps and reimagining the politics of place. Um, and particularly, he demonstrates the ways that discussions of Black spaces and slavery were entangled with white European cartographies of power during the Age of Revolutions. So, one of the things that I want to think about is the fact that early modern cartography comes from a very white European realm, and a lot of what cartography comes from is the imaginations of or of white colonizers, white European colonizers, specifically thinking about imperial ambitions. So, if you're familiar, for instance, with the Mercator map, which of course was ripped off from the Portuguese and possibly even the Chinese, depending on who you ask. One of the first really global maps, a lot of it was sort of speculative. And like Mercator and other European cartographers, these maps were drawn not necessarily with the most sophisticated first-person knowledge of places, but also based on observations and records that are written by travelers, sometimes within third hand. And what I am doing with my work is trying to think about the ways that we can recenter use Black DH methodologies as described by DH scholar Kim Gallen as technologies of recovery, and to sort of flip that to connect the cartographies to the humanity of the people, and particularly the promise for scholarship on Black lives and centering it on Blackness. Let's start by reassessing this map. I don't know if you all can see this map from the David Rumney collection. This is a map drawn by a French cartographer in 1789 by French cartographer Jean-Baptiste Bourguin, and it is supposed to be of West Africa. So in 89, this is well after the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade. But one of the things you notice with this map is this cartouche. And what's interesting about this cartouche is, well, there are certainly a number of different empires in West Africa. One of the big features of the cartouche is that it draws on the Enlightenment fascination with Egyptology, classical Egypt. And they're certainly very removed culturally and otherwise from West Africa. So the cartouche plays on European tropes about Africa with Eurocentric terminology like Moors, and they're a form of intellectual colonizing and cartographical appropriation of Africa that I argue. So these colonialisms work in tandem with popular travel narratives like Leo Africanist to erase the sociocultural and political complexities of a vast and very diverse continent. This maps centeredness on spaces where the dominant population consists of Afro-Arab Muslims, who tended to have higher literacy rates than people in other parts of Africa, were among the more economic missions of histories in Africa as well. And despite some knowledges of historical land claims that predate European colonization, the map is nonetheless an expression of empire rather than one that really offers an African insight into land. And then strict adherences to the political borders here shaped by colonization are therefore limiting, I say. So what does this mean for Black intellectuals who are thinking about the promises of the Black Atlantic, and particularly a Black post-slavery Atlantic? To address the problems in European representations of place on maps, we can start by thinking about the geographies in which they are intended to describe in different ways. So there are radical countermappings which allow us to address the histories of dispossession and colonization. For example, as part of a series of sociological studies on the status of Black Americans that he published, W.E.B. Du Bois and a team of sociologists produced this really rich collections of data visualizations for the 1900s World Map Fair. And it was intended to show the progress of African Americans that had made in the decades since the end of slavery. So using maps and recentered on Black lives. Du Bois' aims was to enhance the collection of photographs that was intended to undercut racist stereotypes of Black Americans, and particularly to their deal with the ways that they're treated in white spaces. But the problem is that the photographs didn't tell the whole story that Du Bois wanted to tell. So he wound up creating these visualizations that drew on imperial sociological studies and data to demonstrate the economic and other ongoing barriers to Black progress. So he wants to have both the Black progress as one piece of it, but he also while acknowledging the structural issues that still exist. So among these many striking visualizations produced by Du Bois was a series of maps that represented a cartography of population demographics in the early years of Jim Crow. The visualization titled Proportion of Negroes in the Total Population of the United States, and this here is an example, shows the relative percentage of the Black population relative to the white population, with the size of both maps growing to illustrate the growth in the nation as a whole. There are a series of subset of mirror series where they are labeled simply with titles as 1/5, 1/6, 1/7, 1/8, et cetera, et cetera. And his aim was to show that the Black population in the United States had actually shrunk during the 19th century. He specifically goes for limited political boundaries to disproportionately draw sets of maps because Du Bois' intentions in this mapping didn't require precise map making or careful attention to cartographical practice. Rather, his emphasis was on presenting the relative shrinkage of the Black population to make the larger point that African Americans were becoming a smaller and smaller minority group, and that this was an obstacle to progress. And the maps also demonstrate that this, from the start of slavery and the start of the Second Industrial Revolution, did very little in the United States to curtail a steady shrinking of the Black population. A simple graphic conveyed a bit of critical information about the Black experience. So these are ways that map making can be used in non-conventional ways outside of some of the conventional Eurocentric cartographies described. So for instance, by Martin Bruckner, who has written a whole series of books, including The Social Lives of Maps. Contemporary approaches to radical mapping that recenter the human experience include Vincent Brown's incredible cartographic narrative of the First Maroon War of 1728 to 1740, which is in many ways a revolutionary conflict between the Windward and Leeward Maroons, who are self-liberated societies, Africa, and the British Empire. The war, which was waged intermittently over 12 years, was part of an effort by Maroons to dislodge British control over land in Jamaica. So Brown's digital project draws from data that aligns the movements of Maroon rebels with those of the British forces and the planters they proposed. And what it does is that it illuminates the care taken in their military strategies and the careful positioning of themselves within Jamaica's mountainous territory to showing that it was anything but happenstance, although many of his carefully critical sources were actually from colonial archives. So this is a way that Brown is not only employing counter mapping methods and radical mapping methods, he's also flipping these colonial white archival spaces to make them tell a different story that recenters Blackness. So what happens when we want to think about these mapping issues, and I apologize that the screen sharing is in the way, is that it made me think about the ways alongside of Dubose that we can think about the unevenness of the political and legal geographies and political terrains across time and place and space that Black intellectuals navigated. And one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of this chapter, both and in the book as a whole, is thinking about in the United States the ways that, and Patrick Rowell's book, among others, does a beautiful job of illustrating this, the ways that slavery goes away state by state, territory by territory, leading up to the Civil War. This is sort of separate from another conversation, was looking at the ways that Black activists were heavily responsible for abolitionism. But if we think about the states in terms of this uneven confederation of slave societies, it's one of the ways to think about a different way of thinking about cartography. So here I have a visualization that I created. Virginia is missing here, but you have some states here that have this immediate emancipation, and then partial emancipation, such as Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, gradual emancipation, so slower burn before the Civil War happens in New Jersey and in New York. New York's legal geography around abolition, of course, is incredibly complicated because it starts out with freeing a subset of slaves that are born after 1827, and then later on the legislation is revised to free folks that are over who are born before then at a certain point. And then here, of course, is DC, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, which all become emancipatory states during the Civil War. DC, of course, with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862. Virginia, which is not in here, is a little bit messier because there is a small subset of formerly enslaved Black Virginians who were freed because of their service during the American Revolution to the American cause. And the reason for that is that despite a huge reluctance on the part of the largely planter elite who led Virginia militias and the Continental Army, including like George Washington, because the British were quick to offer freedom to Black loyalists for their service. And because the Continental armies and the militias were struggling with having enough forces, there was political pressure then to offer the same promise of freedom to Black Americans who joined the cause. So what this looks at is how, moving from this point forward, my work will look at the ways that from the age and revolution beyond, one of the major obstacles to Black freedom was this uneven network of state, national, imperial laws governing slavery. As Catherine McKittrick, Elizabeth Stoddard Pryor, Martha Jones demonstrate, this uneven legal terrain meant that Black mobility became part of how African Americans understood their relationship to place. So McKittrick in particular observes that diasporan geography does not inherently follow Western cartography traditions, and it may be forced to consider settler colonial political boundaries as well as the wages of whiteness. But it also creates imaginary geographies, drawing on Edward Said here, that differ from African and more broadly diasporan concepts of space. I'm also looking at what the explorations of freedom and unfreedom means in what McKittrick calls the cartographies of struggle. This cartography of struggle involves evaluating landscapes for the degrees of freedom and mobility that they afforded enslaved and free Africans, and sometimes in very, very messy ways. Not only did the descendants of the Black Atlantic negotiate their own diasporic cartographies, they had to navigate this uneven political and legal geography that determined their status and constricted their movements. And it was very much a moving target as laws shifted from state to state, particularly as the United States expands westward, and these concerns about not just over local abolitionisms, but whether or not slavery could be expanded are revisited in 1820 and 1845 and 1850 and so on and so forth. These geographies made a tremendous difference in the Black experience, to the point where abolitionist newspapers reported on legal cases involving emancipation or writs of habeas corpus. So, for instance, at one point, in his attempts to petition the Massachusetts legislature for relief from the kidnapping of Black Bostonians, Prince Hall and his fellow activists ran into a problem caused by a weak and ineffectual national government that lacked the legislative authority to address a problem tied to laws around slavery, because there is no meaningful mechanism for to regulate interstate commerce. And then there's a federal government that was deeply unmotivated to intervene in any way that would undermine slavery. So there wasn't really any good legal relief from stopping this kidnapping by both enslavers and by the British of Black Bostonians who were free, and then shipping them into the South and into the British Caribbean as well. But what I want to suggest is that people like Prince Hall and James Forten, who writes in Philadelphia in 1816, and Paul Cuffey, who writes about thinking about the geographies of emancipation, particularly reflects on the failures of the American Revolution to end slavery, i.e., liberty for all, is that they start to project their freedoms in the 19th century, these ideas of a post-slavery existence, on other spaces. So this particular graphic looks at some of these 19th century activists, mostly Black activists in the Americas as well as in the United Kingdom. So up here we have a mixture of people, institutions. There's Samuel Crowther, for instance, who's working alongside of Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce, and then mixed race groups called the British Colonial Society, where they are reflecting their ambitions for, on one hand, a free Black political space by folks like Samuel Crowther, and even Thomas Clarkson on Sierra Leone. At the same time, you have Clarkson and Johnson and other Brits who are reflecting on what they call Yoruba land, which is sort of a made-up term, because though there is a big Yoruba diaspora, they are located further south on the African coast primarily. And the idea is that they're claiming this land as a potential future commercial space for the British Empire. This is sort of the start of the scramble for Africa. So there are some tensions between those who are white Brits who are reflecting on Africa for their possible economic gains. There are their white British abolitionists who are reflecting on Africa in part for moral reasons, but in ways there's sort of these white reasons of white saviorhood. And then there are folks like Samuel Crowther, who is entangled Christian nationalisms. Similarly, this starts a little bit after the expansions in the British designs, abolitionist designs on Sierra Leone and Liberia, but you have the from the American side, Alexander Crummell, W.C.G. Pennington, H. Garnett, um, Robert Finley, and others who are reflecting on to Liberia just south, which becomes colonized initially as a Black space for those who are emancipated from slavery. And obviously, the idea of the American Colonization Society is messy for quite a number of reasons, some of which because folks like Thomas Jefferson just want to have it be a place for emancipated African Americans to be shifted to as Southern states pass laws that forbids the emancipated African Americans to remain in the states in which they were enslaved. Sierra Leone is messy because it winds up being a space for recaptured Africans, and the British wind up impressing these recaptured Africans, and this is Charlotte Fett's work, in order and impressing them to quote unquote pay off the price of their rescue. And then you have folks like Prince Saunders, who are writing and reflecting on Haiti um, as another Black political space, as far as flipping against some of the Thomas Jefferson and some of the other the anti-Black racist thoughts, claiming that African Americans, Black folks were incapable of self-governing, and they're positing Haiti as a success story, as well as trying to challenge some of the white anxieties around Haiti and the idea of what this ultimate success story to one of the largest slave revolts in human history, and what that might mean for the United States as well. So there are a bunch of different overlapping geographic imaginaries, but specifically for Black activists like Pennington and Crummell and Garnett and Crowther, is they have this conversation about, it's part of this conversation among them about what they feel that people like them, who are largely members of the Black African American elite, most of them have never been enslaved, well-educated, middle class, northern United States cities, for example, what they feel that they owe Africa from a point of emancipation. The challenge for them, of course, is that these colonized spaces, the Sierra Leone, Liberia, etc., despite the fact that they are being carved out as emancipatory Black spaces, are being layered on top of indigenous African communities who don't really have a reason to buy into these spaces because they are already Black governed spaces in and of themselves. And so this is sort of an example of the messiness of the geography. So what I wound up doing when I moved into the actual mapping portion of it is that thinking about the ways that people move through these spaces is that I created a data set of over 500 at this point different Black writers, where I collected their names, the years that they wrote, gender data where available, city, state, country, paired it with geospatial data and the source type. And I have some static maps that will appear both in this chapter that I have written as well as my book. But my plan is to actually create an interactive map with it where we can see the people and we can see what source type that they appear, whether it's a slave narrative, a speech, an autobiography, a sermon, legal court documents, et cetera, et cetera. Because one of the things we want to be mindful of thinking about Black DH is not reproducing the old Cleometrics as far as studying the transatlantic slave trade, and particularly one that doesn't erase the people who are writing. One of the reasons why I collected this larger data set is when thinking about Black writings, there tends to be, for good reason, heavy archival emphasis on people like Phyllis Wheatley, Oleota Equiano, Prince Saunders, etc., who are all important. But what gets less attention are people like um, William Allen, um, H.G. Adams, some of the lesser known writers, letter writers, authors, the people who appear in brief form in the sources as fragments. This is drawing on Marissa J. Fuentes' work on archival fragments and archival violence. And what I wanted to do is to think about ways that I could bring some of the less archivally represented folks into conversation with the sort of more dominant archival folks. And what I wound up doing is producing also some data drawn on my colleague Nicole Aljo's work on embedded narratives. This is from the early Caribbean Digital Archive, which is a project of Nicole Aljo and Elizabeth Dillon Maddock, that collects a bunch of sources, digitized sources from across the Atlantic. And what they have done, and this is done on the idea of Aljo's Creole testimonies, is that they grab reports of Black writings from within white archival spaces. So, for instance, they have this narrative of Afiba, which appears in brief form in a larger volume written by Brian Edwards. Ditto, there's another one, Narrative of a Mendigo Servant. So what this does is that I'm able to put these as part of my data, but I label them specifically as embedded narrative. What doing is with this is treating the sources, the archival sources, these testimonials or fragments, brief though they sometimes are, as though they're authentic sources, as reported, as authored by the Black writer that just happened to appear within the white spaces. So this is a way that I was able to sort of expand my mapping using this literary perspective. And then what I wound up doing is I can then produce maps, and this is sort of a preliminary map. These are going to be rendered in Esri ArcGIS, but my prior institution didn't have ArcGIS, so I started working with Tableau. This is a map of looking at all correspondence that written in 1790 to 1830. Geospatially, I could compare where is there predominant was there a lot of correspondence versus where are slave narratives appearing in publication, where are more of the political speeches. I can look along with gender as well. One of the things that some of my preliminary work has recovered is that although Black women are a much smaller proportion of the archive, even with using the embedded model, if we look geospatially, they're scattered or dispersed in equal with the Black men. So what we can do is, even though they take up less archival space, they're appearing in the same spaces that Black male activists are doing. And then you can draw from work like Vanessa Holden, who has this now prize-winning book on the Southampton Revolt, aka Nat Turner's Rebellion, where she asked this question, well, where are the women? Because resistance tends to center men. And one of the conclusions that she draws is that the women were there alongside the men, but they were sort of involved with some of the invisible networks, helping to pass news, helping to penetrate domestic spaces because the women's labor, where they could help to spread intelligence. They're helping to bring food to the fugitive, Nat Turner and his fugitives in the months before their capture, between the end of the revolt and their ultimate trial. One of the other things, and I don't have the slide with me today, that I have found is when we look at these networks of the Underground Railroad and then map all of the sources, for instance, along the Ohio River Valley, there is a distinct correlation between these known underground railway routes and the spread of spaces. So you can take the work, for instance, of Julius Scott and his networks, his communications networks, the passing of rumors, and you can actually, from the data, actually see this being reproduced, where there is distinct correlation between this the spread of the Black archives of resistance and the other traveling sources of resistance of slavery, meaning the Underground Railroad. Well, intellectually, it certainly makes sense. Sort of being able to see it is a whole nother level. Um, the project that I am working on for the interactive map is going to go through 1860 at present. I do have some additional data from slave narratives that were collected, for instance, by the WPA. But because my book ends in 1860, for now, the map will probably end with 1860. Most of my sources are in English, but there are possibility of also repeating this with French and Dutch and other sources as well, which I hope to in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was really fascinating to sit and listen to on this chilly Monday afternoon. So we absolutely invite folks to drop questions in the chat. We invite you to use that reaction button on the bottom to raise your hand, and I can call on you to unmute and ask your question while folks start to formulate their questions and put them in the chat or raise their hand to ask. I will throw one out there for you that I sort of thought of a lot of them, but this is just more of a general one. What do you hope by sort of, you're talking both about a new methodology to look at these sources that many people have looked at before, and then you're also talking about the creation of these both static and interactive maps that will help us visualize these networks in very distinct ways that perhaps we have not yet seen. What do you hope is going to be the real impact of this project for students and scholars? Like, what do you hope your visualizations are going to help people to understand? You're muted, sorry.
So I'm thinking a couple of different ways. One is that I hope that because the visualizations will allow people to click on and see the names, you'll be able to get more exposure, especially for students, be able to get more exposure to people who don't get as much attention either in the scholarship or in the classroom, because realistically, as we all know, those of us who teach, there's only so much content that you can deliver, especially if you're working at a survey level and you have to keep things that are accessible to people who are non-majors. I'm hoping that to open a collaboration so we can, especially since drawing on other archival sources, while I do read French and Dutch and Spanish, it would be a huge project, and I would love to see a larger visualization of the Black archives, particularly because, we are at a time with digitization where Black archives, through works like Gabrielle, uh, the uh, Colored Conventions Project, the Black Abolitionist Archive, various fugitive databases, Freedom on the Move. There are more digital resources out there, and this seems to have exploded, particularly during the pandemic, which is wonderful because it makes it easier for people who are not at resource rich schools to be able to do research, plus their wonderful teaching. But I want them to think about the movement of Black thought, through space. how does the archive, how does Black thought move as it appears in the archive? And I really hope at some point to be able to expand to think about other types of archives, sort of push the core of archives. How, for instance, would we deal with art as part of the archive? How might we deal with oral histories? And geospatially, that would be really tricky, because then, are you talking about, you know, what version are you talking about, especially if you're dealing about the Black diaspora? What version are you talking about? Can we think about the spread of different stories, and so on and so forth? So I think these are sort of some of the ideas that I'm thinking about. Thinking about too, about where Black folks appear in print. Where do Black women appear in print? What core sources? I think that allows us to ask as scholars different questions. So we know that women are predominantly, for instance, in letters, but why? Or we know that we can see that Black women after 1830 start to appear more and more in print. So it allows us to sort of to think about the specifics about the changing nature of the Black archive, right? We know that Black women are there before, but they're becoming more visible in the archive. So we can start looking at these as sort of trends in Black intellectual, in Black thought.
Thank you. I'm excited to be able to think about these things because, yeah, you can't. I mean, it's the interesting thing about, obviously here we're all about teaching with maps, right? We have
Mm.
500,000 maps dating back to the 1470s, and we see a couple hundred classes every semester. And it's bringing these things out and putting them together in new ways to really, I'm really struck by the ability to ask new questions, right? With different people looking at them.
Yeah, and it's part and parcel of another project that I'm on. We are creating, I'm with a team here at Northeastern, we're creating a geospatial archive of 3D models of African buildings. I was in Benin in December, and I'm probably going back in January, or not in January, sorry, in June, where we've brought in equipment to create 3D LiDAR models, and then we are connecting them to the or to this map. We've geo-referenced all of the maps, and then we're hoping to attach interviews, oral histories of community stakeholders. So we're working with community folks. So it's not just us going in there and being digital colonizers, but we have local cultural heritage folks, local community members, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that, and it's primarily in Porto Novo, Benin now, but we're hoping to expand it to other parts of sub-Saharan Africa with partners.
That's exciting. Questions that folks have, you can feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. I always have questions, so. I'm struck by how many places you must have to go to be able to do this research. I mean, it's not just seeing what's been digitized and mapping all of those things out. Will you talk about where and how you're doing your research and how much of it is archival and how much of it you can do remotely?
So this book project I started probably, I'd say I'm about 11 years in to the book project, and it is drawn on, I would say at this point, over 30 archives in 6 different countries. And that's without getting into the digital stuff. I think I have been fortunate. I have been lucky to have a bunch of grants. I had one from Duke in 2015 for the John Hope Franklin Center. I've had funding from the Boston Athenaeum and the Colonial Library and the Drew Methodist Archives and UNC and a bunch of others. So I have been lucky to get a small amount of money from that. But it's also been moving into my position at Northeastern a year and a half ago, being in a better place to be able to actually go to the archives has been helpful. Plus, I did have some small grants from Simmons University, my prior institution. And the digitized stuff, I think, really picked up with the pandemic when I couldn't go anywhere. So it was always my intent to look at digitized archives. But um, when I couldn't physically travel, um, that sort of became my refocus. Am I in touch with I am not in touch with the African Studies Association yet. I'm aware of them, of course, and I'm aware of some of their scholars. As far as my remapping, I don't work on Indigenous histories. I think that's something that a specialist really should be doing. It is complex, and it's certainly something that can and should be done, but I don't think it would be I'm the right person to do it just because my background in indigenous cartographies is not there. I would not do it justice. I would certainly open working in tandem with scholars who are, though.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So, just for those listening along at home, Jessica was reading some of the questions from the chat, and a nice recommendation from Tim on some folks in the African American Studies Association who are working and Africanist cartographers working with digitized collections. I am interested in John Muthala is professor of English and Digital Humanities here at USM, and he talks about Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Almanac of the
Mhm.
Dead,
Yeah,
and the way it
it's
looks at
a brilliant book.
dislocates colonial cartography by creating new centers of power and borders that reflect Native Indian cross-border national spaces. And I like this. This he puts a comment that it goes beyond nation state model to represent space and geography. Are you doing something similar? I mean, do you see your work in that way, that it goes beyond nation state and moves into something else, or where are you
The
situating it?
book the book does, one of the chapters that I'm actually revising a little bit as I write the next chapter, is teasing out the sort of post American independence and the thinking particularly about the ways that Black intellectuals challenge the nation state model. So they're flipping the Benedict Anderson imagined communities, which is kind of limited as far as the ways that these folks are thinking, just because the diaspora is large and messy. Um, for instance, I look at the ways that ideas about Haiti. I'll be looking at the ways that the ideas Haiti transition across the broader Atlantic world, English speaking Atlantic world. I'll be thinking about the way the geographic imaginaries of Africa go beyond the nation state model as well. I use the term entanglements because you can't fully pull away from it, but you can sort of push beyond the strict nation state models. Um, yeah,
Are you, Jessica, like when as you're pushing beyond those things or thinking about them and you're in the archives? I mean, one of the things, so the way in which we collect in a map library, right? So we're working, and I'm so interested in what people are making now in terms of new maps, particularly representing ideas. But we're a historic map collection, right?
right,
We're collecting contemporary maps, but on paper.
right,
We're digitizing them and making those available to folks. We are not yet a collection who's collecting born digital. Not saying we never
yeah,
will. It's just not our emphasis at the time.
right,
But one of the things that's really interesting in building a collection, and we still buy quite frequently,
yeah,
um, and we have collecting priorities. Maps made by women is certainly a large one at the moment. Could buy maps for the rest of my life and never achieve parity in the collection. Maps made by people of color, maps showing Indigenous land possession and dispossession.
right,
But one of the things that's really striking, and I'm wondering what you've seen in the archives because you're sort of making this intervention, right? Like if we're looking at these historic maps, looking at the cartouches, looking at these, notions of power and colonization, that what these maps are representing is, yes, geographic space, but also imperialism and colonization. Have you found any evidence of, making of maps, however you might define them, as you're looking at these archival materials? Because we absolutely have maps made by Black cartographers and Black illustrators in our collections, but they're not coming in as early as the 1820s and 1830s. Are you finding what you would call like mapping in any of these sources that you're looking at from the Black perspective?
Cartographic thinking, yes.
Mm.
Maps, not really, especially not before 1820, 1830.
So how talk more about cartographic thinking, Black cartographic thinking. I really am interested in this.
So, I mean, I would argue, for instance, that Prince Saunders is an example of cartographic thinking because he is thinking about Haiti, both the sort of physical, political boundaries of Haiti, but also sort of thinking about the broader idea of Haiti. So Haiti is both a place and idea, and the idea isn't contained by the physical political biographies and boundaries. And I think that's sort of one of the things that I see a lot with the work is that these Black folks are thinking about cartographies of struggle, they're thinking about place, and in some sense, you know, it's not all that different than the Europeans who imagined place, right? Are sticking these arbitrary new place names on lands that were previously occupied by other people as they're colonizing them, right? But the intentionality and the context in which they're doing it is very, very, very different, in which they're sort of reclaiming they're reclaiming intellectual and political spaces for themselves, right? Um, so it's sort of pushing back against the colonization. I mean, the very fact that he's using Haiti versus Saint Domingue, which is what the Haitian revolutionaries did, because it is a pre-colonial, pre-French name for Haiti versus Saint Domingue, is an example of cartographic thinking, right? And decolonizing decolonize cartographic thinking. So not like maps in the sort of formal sense where they're going to be, purchasable and collectible, but certainly the ideas are there, I would argue.
Yeah, that's really
Um,
helpful.
yeah.
And there's a lot of resources being dropped in the chat for folks too. So
Yeah.
we'll save
Yep.
the chat and make sure that you have those as well.
Thank you.
Just
Yeah,
in those maps.
I've seen the historiographical cartography, but had not yet had a chance to dig into it. But so thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, so much for putting those in there. So as we think about, wrapping up our lunchtime together, thank you everyone for tuning in and joining us and thinking about these ideas in new ways. It's really important for us as people are, developing and working with new work. There's a chance to think some of it out, talk some of it out in a more informal setting. So Jessica, this just makes me really excited to see your new book, to see the new chapters. Would love to have you come back and do a book talk in person.
That'd be great.
After that comes out and to dig into this a little bit more. So there's a lot of thanks for you in the chats, and we will echo that. And also thank you to everyone for coming. We will have all kinds of Monday Map Lunch presentations coming up. At the end of March, we'll be welcoming our own Dr. Matthew Edney, our faculty scholar and Osher Chair in the History of Cartography, who is going to be talking about chromolithography and like the intersections of maps and color. So we will get information out to everyone and have a wonderful week. And Jessica, thank you so much.
Thank you.